He thought he knew his property better than anyone else, but when the old man found strange eggs under the floor of his barn, everything went wrong. What was moving inside made him dial 911 with trembling hands. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you are watching from. The morning began the way most mornings on the old Curtis farm did, slowly, quietly, and with the brittle stiffness that came from both age and the cold. The sun had barely crested the eastern ridge, its light slanting pale and thin across the pasture, when Eli Curtis stepped out onto his porch. He paused there out of habit, not because the view was especially beautiful, but because after 72 years of waking up on this land, his body and mind expected this small moment of stillness before the day began to demand anything of him. The air smelled of wet soil and pine resin, a lingering reminder of the storm that had battered his property throughout the night. The ground squished under his boots as he walked toward the barn, and the boards of the porch let out their familiar groans beneath his weight. Eli rubbed a hand across his forehead, wiping away a sheen of sweat that came not from warmth, but from the effort of moving old bones. He still thought of himself as capable, maybe slower, maybe more careful, but still functional enough to keep the farm alive. There was no one else to do it. The farm had been his grandfather's, then his father's, then his own, and even though his son Mark had made it clear years ago that he had no intention of taking over, Eli refused to let the place die. Not yet. Not while he could still fix a broken fence, haul a bale of hay, or grit through the aches in his hands long enough to repair a leaking pipe. He missed his wife most in the mornings. Leah had always been up before him, making coffee that tasted like burnt earth and humming songs from old radio shows. It had been 5 years since she passed, but sometimes, when the air was cold and the fog hung low, he could almost hear her moving around inside the house, her slippers brushing soft against the wooden floor. He stopped allowing himself those illusions, but they crept back in whenever he found himself too tired to fight them off. As he approached the barn, he noticed the damage immediately. The storm had knocked down a portion of the old gutter, which now dangled uselessly from a rusted nail. More worrying, though, was the way the earth sloped inward near the back wall of the barn. The heavy rain had washed away part of the soil foundation. Eli frowned, the kind of frown that came from years of repairs, and from knowing that the farm always seemed to break faster than he could mend it. He stepped inside. The barn was dim, lit only by the early morning light slipping through cracked boards and worn panels. Dust floated lazily in the air. The scent of old hay and damp wood hung thick enough to taste. Somewhere in the loft above him, a pigeon shuffled nervously, its wings rustling the quiet. Eli walked deeper into the barn, boots crunching on the mix of dirt and straw that covered the floor. Then he saw it. A section of the interior wall had collapsed inward, leaving a jagged gap and a pile of loosened earth spilling into the barn like a small landslide. "Well, that's just what I needed," he muttered to himself, leaning carefully on the shovel he kept propped against a post. He crouched down slowly, because crouching didn't come easy anymore, and touched the dirt. It was damp, but not fully soaked. The collapse had happened sometime during the night. He sighed and began clearing the debris, moving wood and clumps of earth aside one piece at a time. It was tedious work, and his breath grew heavier with every movement. But then his hand brushed against something smooth and strangely warm, not cold like the surrounding soil. He froze. He pushed more dirt away, and there it was. A large, oval object, lying half buried in the earth. For a moment he thought it was a stone, but stones didn't feel soft, or give slightly under pressure. And stones didn't have patterns of faint, branching lines across their surfaces that looked disturbingly organic. "What in the hell?" he whispered. He brushed away more dirt. There was another object beside it, and another. 3 that he could see clearly, their pale surfaces emerging like ghostly shapes from the dark soil. They were too big to be from any bird he knew of, even the largest birds in the region. They weren't turtle eggs, wrong shape, wrong texture. They weren't something a snake or lizard local to Montana could lay either. He knew this land. He knew every creature that called it home, and nothing here left behind eggs the size of small melons. His heart thumped uncomfortably against his ribs, not in fear, not yet, but in a slow, creeping unease. Eli Curtis didn't scare easily, but the older he became, the more he understood that fear didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispered, quiet and persistent, in the back of the mind. Sometimes it showed up when you found something that had no business being where it was. He gently picked one of the objects up. It was heavier than he expected. The weight felt solid, dense. The texture was leathery, almost reptilian. When he shifted it in his hands, he thought only for the briefest moment that something inside moved. It might have been his imagination. He hoped it was. Eli wasn't a man who panicked or jumped to conclusions. He had weathered droughts, animal sickness, medical bills that nearly ruined him, and a heartbreak that actually did. He took things as they came. But this didn't fit into any pattern he understood. And when something didn't fit, it meant trouble. Still crouching, he looked around the barn, as if half expecting someone to appear and explain the objects to him. The barn was empty, except for the pigeon overhead and the faint hum of the wind pushing against the boards. Whoever or whatever had put these things here had done so beneath the cover of night. Or long before he bought the place. But the latter didn't make sense. Placing eggs under the barn wall would have required digging. He would have noticed the disturbed soil, and the barn wasn't old enough for something ancient to be buried under it. He stood slowly. His knees popped. He considered calling the sheriff, but the thought dissolved almost immediately. He had never been on good terms with local authorities, not because he had anything against them, but because age had made him stubborn. Outsiders rarely came onto his land. He didn't like feeling watched, didn't like being told what to do or how to run the farm. Bringing them here meant trouble questions, paperwork, possible accusations. He could almost hear Mark's voice in his mind, lecturing him about letting the farm go if it was too much to handle. No, he wasn't calling anyone. Not yet. Instead, he found an old wheelbarrow and loaded the eggs gently into it, one by one. He covered them with a folded burlap sack, not to hide them, but to keep them warm, and pushed them across the yard toward the old chicken coop. The coop hadn't housed chickens in years. Coyotes had gotten into it one winter, and Eli had never gotten around to repairing it properly. But the structure was still sound enough. More importantly, it had a heat lamp that still worked. Inside the coop, he set the eggs down carefully on a pile of old straw. Dust blew into the air as he moved, drifting like smoke in the narrow beams of morning light. Eli wiped his brow again and plugged in the heat lamp. It flickered once, then glowed bright orange. The eggs glistened faintly under the warmth, their surfaces catching the light in a way that made them look almost alive. A shiver went through him, but he ignored it. He stepped outside and took a long breath. The rain had left the soil soft and the sky cloudless, but the air carried a heaviness he couldn't place. He did his morning chores, fed the cows, checked the pump, walked the fences, but his attention kept drifting back to the coop. He told himself he wasn't worried, just curious. But worry had already sunk its claws into him. By midday, he found himself standing again in front of the coop door. He opened it slowly. The eggs lay exactly where he had placed them, but something felt different. He couldn't explain it at first. Then he noticed the straw around one of the eggs had shifted slightly, as if the egg had moved, as if it had rolled just an inch to the side. "No," he murmured. "You stay put." He crouched and leaned closer. The egg was completely still. But the warmth, had it increased? He placed a hand near its surface without touching it. The air around it felt heavier somehow, thick and warm. He shook his head and stepped back, convincing himself that storms, lack of sleep, and age were playing tricks on him. That night, he didn't sleep much. The wind outside made the barn door creak. Something moved near the fence, quick, soft, but heavy enough to make the boards groan. At one point, he thought he heard a faint scraping sound from the direction of the coop, like claws dragging lightly across wood. But each time he rose from his bed and looked out the window, he saw nothing but darkness and shapes that dissolved when he stared too long. By dawn, the unease in his chest had grown into something colder and sharper. He forced himself outside anyway, as he had every day of his life. The storm debris littered the yard, fallen branches, shredded leaves, patches of churned mud. But what made him stop in his tracks was the sight of deep grooves carved into the dirt beside the barn. Long, parallel scratches running along the ground, as if something large had dragged its claws as it passed. He knelt slowly, touching the grooves with trembling fingers. They were fresh. Too fresh. His eyes drifted toward the tree line. The forest loomed dark and still, but something in it now felt different. Watchful. Eli straightened slowly, feeling the weight of his years all at once, and looked back toward the coop. The eggs waited inside, silent, still, and heavy with secrets he was no longer sure he wanted to uncover. The day had barely begun, and yet he felt the first hint of a truth he did not want to face. Whatever those things were, they were not alone. Eli had lived through enough Montana winters, wildfires, and bad harvest seasons to know when something on his land wasn't right. But nothing in his 72 years had prepared him for the unease that settled in his bones during the days that followed his discovery in the barn. It clung to him like a cold mist, creeping into his thoughts no matter how hard he tried to distract himself with routine. Even the familiar comfort of chores feeding livestock, checking fences, hauling water, didn't offer the grounding they once had. The rhythm of his life felt offbeat, as if the land itself was waiting for something to happen. By the second morning, the air had taken on a strange metallic sharpness. He stepped outside before sunrise, squinting toward the tree line beyond the pasture. The grass was wet with dew, and the early light caught on it like 1,000 tiny blades. The world felt too still. Not even birdsong greeted him. The silence made the skin on the back of his neck prickle. He walked toward the old chicken coop where he had placed the eggs. The ground near the barn still bore the long scratches he'd found the day before. He told himself he'd imagined their depth or that the rain had exaggerated their shape. But as he approached, he saw fresh marks. New grooves cutting deeper into the earth than the last ones. Something heavy had passed through during the night. Something that didn't walk like a deer or bear or anything he'd ever known. Eli tightened his grip on the shovel he carried, not because he expected to defend himself with it, but because the weight of it gave him courage. As he reached the coop door, he paused, hand hovering over the latch. A soft, pulsing sound came from inside. So faint he thought at first it was just the blood pounding in his ears. But the closer he leaned, the clearer it became. Something was tapping. He opened the door slowly. The warmth of the heat lamp flooded the room, painting everything in amber tones. The dust swirling gently in the air, the cracked boards, the straw carpeting the floor. The eggs lay exactly where he'd left them, but the atmosphere felt charged, almost electric. He stepped inside, boots crunching lightly on the straw. The tapping grew a little louder, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat trying to punch its way out. Eli swallowed hard. He crouched beside the nearest egg and stared. The surface quivered beneath the warm light. It wasn't a steady vibration, more like a twitch, small but deliberate. "Easy now," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he meant the egg or himself. He leaned closer, his breath brushing across the leathery surface. The egg gave one sharp jerk. Eli flinched and stumbled backward, bracing his hand against the coop wall. The tapping continued for a few seconds, then fell silent. The egg became motionless again, as if it had exhausted itself. He stayed crouched there for a long minute, heart hammering in his chest. It wasn't imagination. Something inside was alive, strong enough to move, strong enough to try breaking out. And if it could do that, then the presence he felt near his property wasn't just paranoia. There was a connection, one he didn't like thinking about. He forced himself to breathe slowly. He needed to stay level-headed. Panic wasn't going to fix anything. He reached out, not to touch the egg this time, but to examine the straw around it. The shift he'd noticed the day before wasn't random. The straw had been pushed outward, as though the egg had rolled on its own. Then he noticed faint drag marks, a curved arc where the egg had moved slightly across the wood beneath the straw. Eli stood up and rubbed his temples. He felt a pressure growing behind his eyes. Not pain exactly, but a sense of dread all the same. He wanted to walk away, pretend he never found the things. But he was too stubborn for that. This was his land. Whatever was happening, he needed to understand it before he even thought of calling someone for help. He left the coop and walked around the barn again, scanning the ground for fresh signs. The marks were clearer now. Deep tracks pressed into the mud, ending abruptly near the trees. They were wider than any cougar print he'd ever seen and spaced farther apart. Something with a long gait had moved through here. He didn't like it. Not one bit. He spent the rest of the morning repairing the storm damage, fixing the gutter, reinforcing the weakened barn wall, but he found himself glancing toward the woods every few minutes. He listened for sounds that didn't belong, the rustle of leaves when there was no wind, the snap of a branch that didn't fall by itself. More than once he thought he saw something move among the pines, a brief shift of shadow that disappeared when he blinked. After lunch, he fetched his old binoculars from the house and scanned the tree line from his porch. He traced the edges of the forest, moving from shadow to shadow, but nothing stood still long enough for him to identify. The forest remained an unbroken wall of green and darkness. His unease didn't ease. If anything, it grew. Later that afternoon, he went to check on the chickens, what few remained. At first glance, nothing seemed off. The coop gate was still latched. The feed bucket hadn't tipped over. But as he stepped inside, his stomach tightened. Only 4 hens clucked nervously near the corner. He had 6 yesterday. He searched the enclosure. No feathers, no blood, no signs of a struggle. Chickens didn't just vanish without leaving something behind. A fox or coyote would have dragged them away but left evidence. A raccoon would have caused chaos. But here, there was nothing. He crouched and inspected the dirt. There were impressions barely visible, but the shapes were wrong, elongated, deep. Something heavy enough to sink into the packed earth had stood here. Something with claws. He stood abruptly and left the coop, closing the gate behind him with a trembling hand. A cold sweat chilled his spine. His mind wanted to push aside the implications, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the eggs and the missing hens were connected. Something had been here, and it wasn't finished. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He lay in bed, listening to the house settle floorboards creaking as if something walked across them, though he knew that was just old wood reacting to temperature drops. But when he heard a deep, unmistakable thud against the fence outside, his breath caught in his throat. He sat up sharply. Another thud followed, this one softer, like something brushing against the wooden slats. Then came a low, guttural sound, a rough scrape of breath, almost a growl. Eli's heart slammed against his ribs. He reached instinctively for the old rifle leaned against the bedside table. His fingers wrapped around the stock. He held it tight. He listened. Slow, heavy footsteps moved along the fence line. Not the hurried patter of a deer, not the quick steps of a coyote. These steps were deliberate, weighty. Something large was moving through his property under the cover of darkness. He forced himself out of bed and crept to the window. The farmhouse was dark, and when he pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out, he saw only the porch light flickering and the yard swallowed by shadows. Then, at the edge of the faint glow, he caught a glimpse of movement, a low shape gliding past the fence before disappearing into the trees. He didn't see details, only size, far too big to be anything that belonged here. Eli stayed at the window long after the shape disappeared, waiting for another sound. But the creature, whatever it had been, left nothing behind but silence, and the echo of its presence lingering in his thoughts. Eventually, he returned to bed, but sleep never found him. His mind moved in circles, jumping from one worry to another. By dawn, his nerves were stretched thin. He threw on his coat and went out to check the coop again, driven by a gnawing feeling he couldn't ignore. The first rays of sunlight cut through the fog, and the ground glistened with moisture. When he opened the coop door, everything inside looked the same at first glance. The heat lamp hummed softly. The dust stirred in lazy patterns. The eggs lay in their places. But when he stepped closer, he noticed something that made his breath hitch. One of the eggs was cracked. The crack was small, just a thin hairline fracture running across the top. But it wasn't there yesterday. He leaned in closer. The fracture widened ever so slightly as he watched. A faint scraping sounded from inside, like nails brushing against the interior shell. A slow, insistent pressure pushed outward, bulging the surface by a fraction of an inch. It was happening. The creatures inside were growing stronger, preparing to break out. Eli stumbled back until he hit the coop wall. He clutched the edge of the table to steady himself, his lungs filled with a cold, stiff breath. His mind drifted back to the shape he'd seen by the fence, the missing hens, the deep tracks in the mud. A terrifying picture began forming in his mind, one he didn't want to see, but could no longer avoid. The eggs weren't the beginning. They were a continuation. Something else was already here. Something fully grown. Something that moved through the night as though the shadows belonged to it. Something powerful enough to drag prey silently, to scratch gashes into the barn, to stalk the fence line with predatory intent. He didn't know what kind of creature it was, but he knew one truth with absolute certainty. The eggs were only the first warning, and whatever had laid them was still out there, watching, waiting, and getting closer with every passing hour. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Eli felt as though he had already lived through a full day of fear. His sleep had been broken and restless, every faint movement outside his window jerking him awake. Dawn crept slowly over the farm, washing the world in a muted gray light that only deepened the sense of something looming just beyond the edge of sight. His hands trembled as he poured coffee into his mug, though whether from exhaustion or dread, he couldn't tell. Every bone in his body felt heavy. Every sound made him startle. He walked toward the coop as though approaching a gravesite, knowing something irreversible waited for him inside. The ground felt wrong beneath his boots. He couldn't explain wholly that the earth seemed disturbed in ways he didn't remember. Tracks crisscrossed the path, some faint from yesterday, some fresh and sharp-edged, cutting deep grooves into the softened soil. They followed no pattern he recognized. They weren't made by hooves or paws. These impressions were broad, long, clawed, shaped by something powerful enough to sink inches into the mud with each step. The sight of them filled his chest with a cold heaviness. Something had been there, something alive, and very near. He brushed dirt off the coop handle and lifted the latch with slow, deliberate care. The door creaked open, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the morning. The warmth of the heat lamp hit him first, then the thick metallic scent that clung to the air. It was stronger now, sharper, as if something inside the coop had begun to change. Eli stepped forward cautiously, eyes fixed on the cluster of eggs beneath the orange glow. The crack he had noticed the day before now ran jagged across the surface of the largest egg, branching outward like a lightning bolt. As he watched, the shell bulged, pushing outward in short, violent pulses. A low scraping came from within, deliberate, insistent. Eli felt his mouth go dry. He crouched beside it, drawn forward even as fear curled in his stomach. The surface trembled more violently, then split with a sharp, cracking sound that made him flinch. A piece of shell fell away, revealing a dark, wet limb pressing forward from inside. Eli stumbled back, heart pounding. The creature inside shoved again, harder this time, widening the opening. What emerged next made the breath freeze in his throat. A scaled head pushed through the gap, large, angular, glistening under the lamp's glow. The creature blinked, revealing dark eyes that locked onto his with unsettling clarity. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then the hatchling hissed, a deep, guttural sound that seemed impossible for something just born. Fear rooted him to the spot. He had expected... what, exactly? He didn't know. But not this. Not something so fierce, so alert, so unmistakably predatory. The creature forced itself further out, shedding pieces of leathery shell as it wriggled free. It landed heavily on the straw, its limbs already strong enough to support its body. Its claws dug into the wood beneath the straw as it tested its footing. The tail, thick and muscular, curled and slapped once against the floor with a crack that echoed painfully in the small space. Eli reached instinctively for the door, but before he could retreat, the second egg shuddered violently. A ripple ran across its surface, followed by a loud crack as it split. A second creature began fighting its way out, the movements frantic and powerful. Straw scattered as the egg rocked and rolled, knocking against the first hatchling, which responded with a hiss of agitation. The third egg trembled as well, its shell quivering under the persistent, rhythmic pounding from within. Panic tore through Eli in a wave. He backed toward the door, fumbling with the latch. This was no longer just a mystery. It was a threat. A deadly one. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the latch entirely. Behind him, the first hatchling took a slow step toward him, head bobbing slightly, as if studying him, measuring him. He froze, chest tight. Another sharp crack sounded as the second egg split open further, revealing more dark scales and claws. He wrenched the door open and stumbled out into the daylight, slamming it behind him. His heart hammered like a trapped bird inside his chest. He grabbed the nearby wooden crate he used for storing feed and dragged it toward the coop door, wedging it firmly against the frame. The hatchlings were small, but they were strong enough to break through if they kept pushing. He stepped back, breath unsteady. The world felt too quiet again. The silence grew heavier. And then he heard it. A sound so deep it vibrated through the ground beneath him. A slow, heavy step, followed by another. The kind that came from something weighing far more than any wolf or bear in these mountains. Eli turned toward the tree line, dread building inside him like a rising tide. Something moved between the shadows, a large shape weaving through the tall pines, too low to be a moose, too fluid to be a bear. Branches snapped beneath its weight, the sound echoing in the still air. He could see only parts of it, a flicker of dull scales through the darkness, a thick tail dragging across the underbrush, the curve of a muscular back. The creature paused at the edge of the trees, where the shadows met the open field. It didn't come out. It simply waited, its breath audible even from a distance. Slow, heavy, almost rhythmic. Eli realized with a grim jolt that the creature wasn't searching. It was listening. Listening to the sounds coming from the coop. A low growl rolled through the air, deep enough to shudder in Eli's bones. He took several steps back, his gaze fixed on the spot between the trees. The creature's shadow shifted, and for the first time he caught a glimpse of its eye. A pale yellow orb that glinted faintly in the dim light, unblinking and alert. It knew the eggs were there. It knew the hatchlings were alive. And it wanted them. Eli backed away slowly, moving toward the house. He didn't take his eyes off the tree line. The creature didn't advance, but its presence loomed like a threat carved into the air. Eli reached the porch and grabbed the old shotgun leaning beside the door. The metal felt cold and unfamiliar in his hands. He hadn't fired it in months, maybe years. He didn't know if it would do anything against something that size, but it was the only weapon he had. A sudden crash from inside the coop snapped his head toward it. The wooden crate he'd wedged against the door rattled violently. Loud, frantic hissing erupted from inside. Something slammed against the wall from within, shaking the structure. Straw and dust burst from between the boards. The hatchlings were growing more frantic, more desperate. And the mother, because that was what it had to be, let out a guttural bellow that made Eli's throat close. He didn't have time to think. Instinct took over. He ran to the shed near the far end of the yard and yanked the old tractor's battery-powered floodlight from the shelf. The cord was frayed, but it still worked if he connected it to the portable generator. He dragged both items into the yard, fumbling with the wires, as the creature's growls grew louder. His breath came fast, uneven, but he forced his shaking hands to move faster. The moment the lights flared to life, he swung them toward the tree line. The creature roared in response, a sound so powerful it shook the leaves on the nearest branches. Eli pointed the light directly at its silhouette. For a brief second, the beams caught its form clearly, a massive reptilian figure, mottled scales covering its broad body, claws digging into the ground, teeth glinting as it bared its jaws. Its eyes narrowed at the light, pupils contracting sharply. It hurt the creature's senses. Good. Eli blasted the horn attached to the generator. The blaring sound sliced through the air, startling even the hatchlings inside the coop. The mother snapped her head toward the noise. She moved forward, low and deliberate, her tail sweeping the ground like a whip. Eli hit the horn again, louder, longer. He waved the floodlight wildly, forcing the bright beam across her face. The creature recoiled, clawing at the dirt, trying to escape both the noise and the blinding light. Eli felt a surge of adrenaline. He stepped closer, shouting at the top of his lungs, though he wasn't sure if the creature understood or if he simply needed to hear himself over his own fear. The noise and the light disoriented it. It staggered back, stumbling toward the trees. Eli kept advancing, forcing it away, step by shaking step. But just as the creature reached the shadows, it whipped its head around and glared at him with a fury that rooted him in place. Its chest heaved. Its growl rumbled like distant thunder. But then, slowly, it faded deeper into the forest. The trees swallowed it whole, and the sound of its movements grew fainter, then vanished entirely. Eli stayed frozen in place until his legs gave out and he sank to the ground. He sat there for a long while, shotgun across his lap, sweat pouring down his face. His breaths came in ragged pulls. The danger wasn't gone, only delayed. The hatchlings were still in the coop. They were alive, and the mother had every intention of returning for them. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone and dialed 911. His voice shook as he tried to explain what was happening, but the dispatcher quickly picked up on the urgency in his tone. She told him officers and wildlife authorities were on their way and urged him to stay inside until they arrived. Inside. as if his farmhouse walls meant anything to a creature like that. But Eli obeyed. He retreated to the house, locking every door and window. He sat in the living room, shotgun across his knees, eyes fixed on the fields outside. Minutes dragged into an hour, each one feeling longer than the last. The silence grew suffocating. The tension thickened. At any moment he expected the creature to reappear, charging out of the trees, ready to tear the coop and everything in it apart. Then, faintly at first, he heard it. The distant wail of sirens, weaving through the hills like a promise of salvation. Blue and red lights cut across the fields. Patrol cars screeched to a halt near the barn. Officers in heavy vests rushed out, accompanied by wildlife specialists carrying reinforced crates and long catching poles. Eli met them on the porch, voice hoarse, body shaking. He led them to the coop. The creatures inside had grown quiet, though the cracks on the eggs' surfaces had spread, the shells trembling periodically, as if the hatchlings were bracing for another attempt to escape. The authorities didn't waste a second. They secured the coop, opened it carefully, and used long poles to restrain each hatchling as it emerged. The creatures hissed fiercely, snapping their jaws, tails whipping with a strength that stunned even the professionals. It took 2 grown men to hold each one steady, long enough to place it inside a reinforced crate. Sweat poured down their faces. One officer grunted that the strength of these juveniles was more than he'd seen in any known reptile of their size. Once the last hatchling was captured and locked away, the air grew momentarily lighter, but only momentarily. The officers turned toward the tree line, weapons raised, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. They knew the mother could return at any second. Their tension spread through the yard like static. Then came a sharp crack of branches in the distance, a rumble of earth, a shape moving between trees. The officers shouted warnings, and several aimed tranquilizer rifles. The creature emerged briefly, roaring in a sharp, furious bellow that made the officers recoil even as they took aim. 3 darts flew through the air, striking the creature's flank almost simultaneously. It roared again, thrashing, tearing up chunks of dirt. But the tranquilizer was powerful. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, its movements faltered, its legs buckled, and with one last, shuddering growl, it collapsed among the trees. Eli watched, breathless, as the creature fell still. The officers kept their weapons trained on it until they were certain it wouldn't rise again. By the time the authorities cleared the area, the sun hung low in the sky, painting the farm in weary gold. The yard looked battered. Gouges in the ground, overturned equipment, footprints of the officers scattered everywhere. The reinforced crates containing the hatchlings were carried to the trucks and loaded carefully. Officers spoke quietly among themselves, exchanging looks of disbelief. One of them approached Eli to explain what they had discovered down the road on the neighbor's property: cages, heating lamps, and signs of illegal animal trafficking. His neighbor, quiet, elusive, always muttering to himself, had been keeping exotic animals for years. The eggs had likely been buried during the storm, hidden with the intention of being retrieved later. The mother must have escaped weeks ago and had been wandering the forest, searching for her offspring. The thought made Eli's stomach twist. That massive creature had been on his land the whole time. Watching? Waiting. The last patrol car left, leaving Eli standing alone in the fading light. The farm felt painfully quiet. Too quiet. But for the first time in days, there was no threatening shadow lurking near the trees, no scraping of claws, no low, haunting growl drifting through the night air. He walked slowly to the porch and sat heavily on the old wooden step. His hand still trembled, his breath still shook. But the danger, unbelievably, was over. The stillness settled around him, gentle this time, like a blanket rather than a warning. He didn't expect the phone call. It rang just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. For a moment he considered ignoring it, too exhausted to deal with anything more. But the number flashing on the screen made his heart stutter. It was his son. He answered with a shaky hello. Mark's voice came through, unsteady and rushed. He'd seen the news, read the reports, watched the footage taken by neighbors of flashing police lights on the old Curtis property. He asked if his father was all right. He said he was coming home. Eli didn't speak for a long moment, unable to form words through the swell of emotion tightening his chest. When he finally managed a response, his voice cracked. He didn't know what this meant for them, for the wounded bond between father and son. But he knew one thing. He was no longer alone. The night deepened. The forest stood silent. And for the first time in a very long while, Eli Curtis felt the faint stirrings of hope. Fragile, unfamiliar, but undeniably present, rising steadily through the fear that had consumed him. Life had nearly slipped from him, but life, in its strange, unpredictable way, had given something back. And as he sat on the porch of his battered farm, listening to the quiet hum of insects and the soft sigh of the wind through the pines, he allowed himself to believe that tomorrow, for once, might be better than the day before. If you want more stories, hit subscribe and check out the next videos on the channel. Share this one with someone who'll enjoy it.